Hello, and welcome to The Connection. This podcast is about understanding and building the connection we have with others and with ourselves. I hope that through this podcast you will learn to have more joy and fulfillment in your life. I'm your host, Jared Hurst, and I'm back. So, for those of you that don't know and don't follow me on social media, I have been gone for the last 8 days in Fiji. It's been quite an experience. Very hot and humid, very beautiful. My favorite moment is, well, I have lots of favorite moments, but my favorite weather moment is when there was like a 25 mile an hour wind and I'm sitting by the ocean in the sun in a hammock, because that was just perfect. It felt nice and cool, but it was also nice and warm. And anyway, it was awesome. What you don't know is that I normally go through quite a process in order to make a podcast episode. Yes, I'm really new at this, and yes, I'm still defining my process. But the process that I have currently is I think for a while about what topic I think I should go over for the week. Then after thinking about it for a while, I make a rough outline, probably marinate on that for a little bit, add to the outline, then I record an episode. Once I record the episode, and I record the episode all in one take. Maybe I should do it in multiple bits, but I currently do it all in one full 30-minute segment. Once I've recorded that episode, I listen to the episode, and then I sleep on it. I listen to it the next day, and I marinate on it, and I listen to it again. And usually after a day or two or three of listening, I'll make a new outline and I'll record it a second time. Because I have found that once I have time to think about it, I can make things more succinct and I can see where I feel like I'm losing energy or I'm losing interest. I'm still definitely working at that. I recognize that there are times when I'm speaking that things just don't flow the way that I want them to, but it's a skill, right? It's like I talked last week on the podcast, it's all about figuring out what's holding you back. And those kind of things don't disappear overnight. It's a process. The reason I'm telling you about my process is I spent the last 8 days thinking about what I was going to be talking to you today. I realized I wasn't going to have time to do my normal method because I just got back from Fiji and I don't want to make everybody wait for my podcast for those people that are listening to my podcast. So I spent all 8 days thinking about what I was going to talk about, and then I realized, because of some recent events in my life, that what I wanted to talk about is not what I wanted to talk about today. I feel there are building blocks and things that I definitely want to discuss because I feel like they help in everything else that I might want to cover on this podcast. I feel that one of those things that I want to talk about is emotions and emotional regulation. That's something that I want to talk about today, but I kind of want to skip ahead. Before I dive into emotions and processing emotions, how you work with emotions, I want to talk about a specific emotion. And that emotion that I have felt inspired to talk about is grief. Grief, in some ways, is a really scary topic for me. I want to talk and help people with things that I feel I have learned how to manage in my life at the level that I want to manage them. So when I talk about emotional regulation, there are certain emotions that I feel I have grown so much as an individual with my way of working with that emotion. The reason grief is so scary for me, grief is the most difficult emotion. And I don't think I'm alone in that. I think there's a lot of people that grief is the most difficult emotion that they work with. It's not that I don't have something powerful to share about grief. I just am not at the level that I would like to be about it. But that's okay. I feel inspired to talk about this, and so I want to share it with you. And as I learn more and as I grow more, I'll share more about it. When I first started really diving into grief was when I was going through some of the most grief in my life. It was a year ago, December. So December 2022, I had finalized my second divorce in October of that year. So just a few months removed from that. I was grieving a lot about those relationships that I'd lost through that divorce, and grieving because of other things that had happened in my personal life that were really difficult for me to manage. During that time, I came across a podcast, a man by the name of Andrew Huberman. And for those of you that know Andrew Huberman, you probably love him if you're somebody that likes that kind of thing. It's very sciencey. They're very long, but that's great for me. His podcast episodes are anywhere from 2 to 4 hours long. And just a really quick synopsis. What he'll do is he'll go through and talk about all the science behind something. And then over the course of that, he ends up giving you tools that you can use in your personal life. So I was going through this incredible, emotional, one of the most painful times of my entire life. I would say that between May of 2022 and May of 2023 was the most challenging, emotional 12 months of my entire life, no question. It was really hard, and there was a lot of grief during that time. So I come across Andrew's podcast, and I binge listened. It was totally my style of things. There was talks on dopamine and serotonin and attention deficit and caffeine and all these things. I ended up listening to 12 episodes in a course of 2 weeks. So probably about 25-ish hours of audio in a 2-week period. I just really delved into it. And one of the episodes that I listened to was on grief. And I've always said that if I ever get to meet him, if I ever get to meet Andrew, I would probably cry. And I would tell him how grateful I am for his episode on grief, because I needed help. Now, some of the things I'm talking to you about today are my own ideas and my own theories, but some of those things are things that I learned from Andrew, so I definitely want to give him credit for the things that I'm about to share. When I listened to him talk about grief, he talked about our connection to people. And he basically said that it boils down to 3 things: where somebody's located, when we're going to see them again, and how emotionally close we are to that person. So when you're grieving somebody that's passed away, you may have a religious belief that you'll see them again, or you may have a belief that you'll never see them again. So time is definitely limited. At best, you believe that you'll see them again after you die. Maybe there's some people that believe that they can see people that have passed on while they're in this life. But for most people, they have this belief that they're never seeing this person again until after they die, and maybe never. So that's time. Space, where they are. A lot of people have this belief that they're in heaven. Some people believe that they no longer exist. I don't want to dive in all the different ways in which people equate space, but you can see why grief is such a difficult emotion. because the time and the space are out of your control for the most part. And the closeness, your connection to them, that also affects your level of grief. So obviously, the closer you are to somebody emotionally, the more grief you're going to feel around that individual. And the reason why those three things are really important is because when you understand how we relate to people, it helps you understand how you can work through grief. I'm going to talk about this a lot. I'm going to have an episode specifically to emotions and emotional processing, as I call it. But my core belief is that emotions are in our life for a purpose. If you think about us as humans, we're animals on some level, right? We have a nervous system that is there for main purpose is to keep us alive. It's to drive us towards things that will help us stay alive, like emotional connection, food, a social network, drive us away from things that won't keep us alive, jumping off cliffs, whatever. We have all these things meant to sustain us. So when you start looking at emotions, I had this thought one day. I said, well, then what's the purpose of emotions? Why would our mind have emotions? From an evolutionary standpoint, why would I want emotions? From a creationary standpoint, why would God want us to have emotions? There's got to be a reason for it. And so my belief is that our emotions are there to help us. And the best way for us to work through emotions is to work with their purpose. What I want to show you is, based on some things that I learned from Andrew, how we can work with the emotion of grief in order to help us work through that time. And if I were to take everything that I learned from Andrew in a 2-hour episode and summarize it into one sentence, it is this: grief is about accepting what is and letting go of what was. That's in essence what our grieving process is. It's allowing us to accept the reality of where we are in relationship to this person and letting go of the changes that have taken place in our life. So how do we do that? How do we cope with this loss? And that loss can be death, it can be a divorce, it can be a breakup, it can be somebody moving away. There's lots of different reasons why we grieve. I don't necessarily think that one is harder or easier than the other. Losing people to death is definitely difficult. But I also believe that breakups can be as difficult, and sometimes they can feel more painful. And it's because of this relationship to space, time, and closeness. When somebody dies, you know you're not ever seeing them again. You have some semblance of an idea of where they are. You either believe that they don't exist or you believe they're in heaven. When you break up with somebody, you might see them again. Depending on where they're located, you might run into them again, and you have no idea when that's going to be. And it makes it harder for your brain to move through the grieving process, because grief, with the way that Andrew explains it, is basically our mind remapping our relationship to that person. Once you've remapped that relationship to that person, then you generally have gone through the majority of the grieving process. That doesn't mean you stop feeling pain when you think about them. That doesn't mean that you're never going to have something that reminds you of them and then you're going to feel hurt or pain around that loss. But it goes from something where you're feeling that emotion day in and day out, minute in, minute out. As you know, sometimes when you're dealing with grief, it feels like it is your entire life, just constant pain. and you don't know how to deal with that. And that's why I really wanted to talk about this, is I know some people that are dealing with some really intense grief right now. And I feel like this is such an important topic. So how do you remap this relationship to this person? Especially if you know that you might run into them again or you might see them again. Well, there's a couple of key things that I took from listening to Andrew, and that is a lot of people will use one of these three methods. They will, if it's a person that's still alive, they will make it so that they can't see them again. They'll delete them off their social media. They will cut all contact and block them and not text with them and whatnot. Because then what happens is it actually allows you to work through that grieving process better. Because if you have this thing where that person could reach out at any moment or talk to you at any moment, or you could see them on social media at any moment, then your brain doesn't know how to remap that relationship to that individual because you're not sure when you'll see them again. And sometimes people will move to a different state. They'll move away because it's too painful to be next to that person, or they'll move homes or something because they might run into them in person because of where they live. And you see that a lot with divorces and breakups and things like that. But the thing that I think Andrew pointed out that's really, really important is to not change that relationship, that emotional connection. Some people, what they'll do is they'll try to demonize this person, or they'll try and lessen their emotional connection to that person by changing their memories around them. And that's not always the healthiest way in order to deal with grief. The way that he talked about it that I really love is that you don't lessen your connection to the person. You appreciate the time that you had with them. You appreciate the memories that you had with them, whether this is a person, a place, a thing, whatever it can be, because people can have grief around lots of different things like pets and other things like that. There's nothing wrong with appreciating and loving that person for the connection and the time that they had with you in your life. At the same time that you're having that, you have to keep reminding yourself of what the reality is of where you're at and accepting that change. When I first heard Andrew talk about that a year-ish ago, 14 months ago, I couldn't understand how to do it. I was like, how am I supposed to maintain an emotional connection to people that I'm hurting over? How am I supposed to still love them and still love the experiences that we had together, but also accept that things are over and let go of them? And it's taken me probably a year to get to where I could do that. It is not easy. That's one of the things that I've learned while studying grief. Grief does not have a dedicated timeline. There is chronic grief. You don't want to get into a situation where you're grieving for the rest of your life. But you can't, if somebody tells you that you should only grieve for this amount of time, that's bull crap. There isn't a set amount of time to grieve, but there are things in order to help you. So one, appreciate the connection you had. Maintain that connection, but accept that things have changed. Manage when you see them if they are still alive. That means maybe cutting off contact from somebody. I've had people that I've grieved about that I still wanted to maintain a connection with. And I've had to break contact from that person for a period of time so that I could go through my grieving process and get to a point where I could relate to that individual in a healthy way before I could bring them back into my life in a new, different role. That is not an easy process. Don't play the what if game. Every time you play the what if game, well, if I would have done this, if I would have done that. Every time you envision new memories with that same person, like you envision them having a new experience with you, not a memory of a past experience, but creating new memories like visions and daydreaming about that person. Those things do not allow you to finish the grieving process. They don't allow your mind to remap that relationship to that individual. So what you're doing is you're setting yourself back. And so every time you constantly go back to that same thing over and over and over again, that's how you can create like a chronic grief. Because you're not allowing your mind to move on. You're not allowing it to accept these changes. And so really the coping mechanisms around grief are about helping yourself accept the changes in your life. It's journaling about what you're experiencing. I like to do verbal journaling. I'll turn on a recording, I'll drive in the car, and I'll talk to myself. Sometimes I'll have conversations with myself. I'll ask myself a question, and I'll pause, and I'll wait to see what kind of response I feel. I feel that can be a great way to work through emotions, is in essence, when you do that, when you ask yourself a question and then you pause and listen, you're having a conversation on some level with your subconscious mind. You're waiting to see what that little inner voice is going to say. I like to free write and free talk. So I'll just start typing and not think about what I'm typing and just let stuff come on the page. I'll do the same thing with talking. I'll turn on a recording and I'll just talk to myself and let things flow. It's amazing how that allows your subconscious thoughts to come out. It can be a great tool and help you realize what is going on inside that you aren't consciously aware of. It's just free writing or free talking. Talking with other people. How many times have you had it where you talk to somebody and they don't even give you any advice, but just by expressing yourself out loud, it allows your mind to process through things and to come to its own conclusions and come to its own solutions. I do that with myself. I'll talk to myself in the car and I'll tell myself about what I'm going through. Because sometimes I don't have somebody else that I can go talk to and work through things. And the truth is, a lot of the times the answers that we need are inside of ourselves. We have the answers. We just need to access them. And sometimes what you do is you start talking to somebody. And it helps, because when we know that somebody else has gone through something that we've gone through, when we can define and understand what we're experiencing as humans, we manage situations better when we are able to put a definition on it, when we're able to understand it, and when we're able to understand that others have been through the same thing and that they have come out on the other side. It helps settle our nervous system. It helps us to calm ourselves because we believe that we can understand what's going on, and because we can understand what's going on, we can work through it. You see that happen all the time. The guys that are listening, listen up. You see this all the time with women. Women don't want you to solve their problems when they're telling you about their problems. They want you to hear their problems and help them feel okay about the emotions that they're experiencing. Then, because they have been heard and have been able to express what they're feeling, then all of a sudden, they're able to solve their own problems. And it's the same thing with grief. Sometimes we just have to share with somebody else what we're going through. And once we do, then all of a sudden we're able to work through that a lot better. You know, one of the things that I did is by learning that grief is all about accepting what has happened. I have written goodbye letters to people that I love. I have turned on a voice recording and talked to that person about all the things that I don't feel like I get to tell them. And I work through all the different emotions that I'm feeling. I've had times where I yell at them. I've had times where I cry to them. I've had times where just whatever it is that I feel like I'm experiencing, I experience that through my letters, through my voice messages. And that doesn't mean that I deliver those messages to those people if they're alive. But being able to grieve is all about being able to work through what you're feeling. And that really comes down to managing what you're thinking and then being compassionate to yourself. Being compassionate, understanding that what you're going through is part of the human experience. I think it's when we try and repress what we're feeling is when we get in trouble, or when we spend so much time in that emotion that it becomes chronic. I think there's a happy medium between the two. I think if you repress those emotions and you don't allow yourself to grieve, you don't allow yourself to be angry, you don't allow yourself to feel whatever emotion it is that you feel, then I think it bottles up and then you don't work through it. And so it becomes this cancer that infects your emotions, and it can lead to depression and other things like that. But when you allow yourself to embrace the emotion and work through it, empathize with yourself, be compassionate to yourself, but then also have a growth mindset and look towards the future, look towards the things you can control, and start taking action, I think that's the best way to work through grief. Because if all we do is feel emotion, we get down about it, and it becomes this overwhelming thing that we can't deal with. When we repress it, it becomes this infection that eventually comes out in other areas of our lives. So feel the emotion, experience the emotion, have compassion for yourself, work through it, and then move forward. You know, grief is so challenging for so many people. It's not a simple thing. But that's why we have people in our lives. We have people that we can turn to, and there's so many of us that feel like we're being a burden on those other people. But you're not a burden on anybody. And if somebody makes you feel like they're a burden, then they're not your person. The people that love and care about you will show up for you when you need them. If you let them know what you need and why you need them, they will be there for you. And if you don't feel like you have anybody in your life, I promise you there are people that are willing to show up for you. There are people that I barely know, and if they called me right now and said, I'm dealing with this thing, I would be there in a heartbeat. I had this time once when somebody contacted me and they said, I have this friend that's going through this thing and they need somebody. I had never met them before, and I left my house at 11:30 at night to drive an hour so that I could go meet that person, so that way I could be there for them. And I don't tell you that because I think there's anything special about me. The reason I tell you that is because I know there are other people like me. There are people that you've never met that will show up for you if you need it. I promise you that. There are people. And in fact, I feel like the people that have the most empathy that would show up for somebody that they don't know are the people that have been through that pain. People that have been through that kind of pain don't want to see other people go through that kind of pain. And they'll be there for you. So don't do it alone. There are people in your life. If you're spiritual, there's God. There are people that you can talk to. Don't do it alone. You are not alone. Every time I end my podcast, I end it by letting you know that you're not alone. Grief, in my opinion, is the one time that you really need to reach out and surround yourself with a support group. There are people. You are not alone. I'm here for you, and so many others are. So until next time, I hope this helps you, and I'll see you next week.